Welcome, and what an honor to be on this stage with two incredible journalists who've put together an incredible piece of work. Hopefully you're one of the first 50, so you can get your copy and read it, because it surely is worth the read. And now, I'm sure as the conversation gets going, you might have some questions. You don't need to raise your hand or anything like that. The library staff will be walking around with cards. You can write your question down, and then we definitely have time at the end, and I'll try to get to as many as your questions, as we can. So we'll get right to it. We just heard, and anyone who's watched the news today knows that Tyre Nichols was laid to rest today in Memphis. And it has such a strong tie to the work that you all have done here with this book. I would just love to know your reaction to what happened in Memphis that we've been seeing over the past couple of days, and what goes through your mind when you saw what happened to Tyre?
I can start. First of all, it's really great to be here. Thank you to everyone for coming out. We know it's cold outside and there's a lot going on, so we really appreciate you taking the time. We need to be taking the time to have these kinds of conversations because when George Floyd died in 2020, it started a number of conversations. It started Robert and I and a number of our colleagues at the Washington Post on a journey of finding out more about George Floyd and not only how he died, but how he lived and how his life was impacted by institutional racism and systemic racism. And we clearly have more work to do as a country, as a society, as we see hate, as we see violence, as we see another mother having to cry over the loss of a son, another child without a father, because of someone being lost to the violence that can come when institutional racism intersects with the power of state force and the person of a police officer, in this case multiple police officers. One of the things we learned in writing about George Floyd was that it wasn't just those last moments that everyone came to know in which George Floyd saw himself intersecting with institutional racism. This is a story that traces back hundreds of years within his family, to his very birth into deep poverty, to his experiences in the school system, which was segregated when he was coming through the school systems, to his experience with the housing systems and the healthcare systems and the criminal justice system before he lost his life under the knee of a police officer. And so now that we're going through this process again and talking about police brutality, talking about institutional racism, and with the case of Tyre Nichols, it just brings up a lot of the things that we learned as we were writing this book about how institutional racism can kill someone very quickly, but it also can kill someone very slowly over the course of their life. And that's what we found in studying George Floyd's life. And I can only wait to hear more about Tyre Nichols and how he lived, because in a tragic way, we only see people who become hashtags in their worst moments. We only see them as they die, and they live full lives, and they have ups and downs and highs and lows and experiences. And one of the things we wanted to do as journalists was to humanize George Floyd and allow him to come to life on the page in the way that he was not able to do in those videos that we saw of him dying. And we wanted people to have a chance to be able to meet him and know about his story, know about his family, and even more importantly, to know about the America that he knew, because it's an America that many of us don't know. Many people who don't grow up in deep poverty, who don't grow up with institutional racism rearing its head in multiple different ways as they come of age, as George Floyd did, will never know that kind of America. And so it was important for us to bring that America to life on the page and allow people to see it and realize that we all play a role in trying to make it, and trying to make that America a thing of the past, because a racist America, an unequal America, a trauma-filled America, even if it's segregated and even if it's in a ward that you never visit or a part of the city that you never go to, it impacts us all, and it's important for us to all play a role in making those places and that kind of experience better for our fellow Americans.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. This morning, Juby, I couldn't stop thinking about Tyre Nichols' mom and the really cruel reality that so many mothers have to live through in this country, that they don't, no parent would want to see their child die. But if you die in the way like Tyre Nichols died, or like George Floyd died, you almost don't get to plan that either. You don't have the privilege of mourning alone. You have to do it publicly. The sanctity and intimacy between mother and son becomes something that becomes a part of a larger narrative of what's wrong with this country. And I thought about just how cruel it must be for a mother to be able to have to endure that, even if they're willing to take on the chance. One of the things, as Tolu said, that we believed in strongly was to be able to tell the story of George Floyd in hopes that one day that when we think about him, we would not get sort of the brief glimpses that we did at his funeral. Same thing with Tyre Nichols. And I think, again, we begin to see the beating of a familiar drum in terms of what can be done to improve race relations in this country, how to make things better for Black Americans. And so, again, there are two really big questions. One, what's it going to take, right? What's it going to take for us to realize that if we don't get to the roots of systemic racism that poison the lives of so many people in this country, that we will not heal as a country? The second thing that I think it prompts us to remember, right, is that if Tyre Nichols was living today, if he had just gotten a ticket, right, he would still be in a punitive system that could have terrified his life if he got the ticket. That his son Milo will still be going to schools that are underfunded, that don't believe in seeing his full humanity. So there's a big challenge for us in terms of being able to recognize those who lived and those who died.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So let's walk back a bit to this book and how it came to be. Two journalists who are working full-time, covering stories, and then summer 2020 happens. Just tell me how we got to here. I assume maybe you went out and covered some of the protests that were happening, and then how did that work turn into deciding to write this book?
So neither Tolu and I covered the protests, actually. For one, I can speak for myself. It was a world in which I did not want to live in. I had covered protests in Ferguson and in other places. It's a really hard thing. It's very trying on the spirit. But even as they were happening, we could sort of feel and see that there was something very different about this moment. And perhaps that this time there'd be an opportunity offered to really have a discussion about systemic racism. So we were both working at the Washington Post at the time. And usually when a person dies in the way George Floyd dies, there's a typical standard profile that we run on the day of their funeral. It's not very good. It has a few quotes from people who might have known him, maybe a discussion of their record, police record, if they had one. And our editors decided to hold that back. It was sort of a brazen move, and said, we're going to cede this profile to whomever wants to do it, but we believe that we could do something bigger because we have the opportunity. Those conversations led to a series of 6 stories that ran in the Washington Post that were called George Floyd's America, that looked at George Floyd's life through the lens of systemic racism. So we looked at different institutions that had touched George Floyd and the history of them, and how these things that are supposed to comprise the social safety net in the country ended up having some really big gaping holes. And along the way, the stories did well. We were really satisfied with the remarks. But along the way, I think anyone who had interacted with the Floyd family or had gotten to know and learn about George Floyd really began to develop a fondness for him, not just because of how he died, but who he was, his persistence, his ambition, the fact that he had a name in his community before he had a name that the world had known. And so we knew that there would be some really great value in getting people to understand the person we got to understand. And also by understanding him, we'd have a better understanding of who we are as a society. Because so many of the larger things that impede the lives of so many people here happened in George Floyd's life.
Yeah.
And just to add to that,
Yeah.
to what Robert said so well, we saw George Floyd's story as an American story, and it's not often that people like George Floyd get to have their life story told as an American story, but his experience is an American experience for all of its highs and lows, and we wanted to put that on the page so people could see that this also is America, and and sort of sit with that for a bit and decide, is this the America that we want to have? And so we wanted to be able to showcase that.
Can you tell us, and I know we're all going to read the book, so I don't want you to, too much away, but I mean, y'all put a lot of work into this. I mean, 400 some interviews. I get exhausted just with like 2, and because it's a lot, because, when you interview people, you talk to them, you have a conversation with them, it can be very emotional and it can be very draining. And so what was that like for you all to, do that work? 400 some interviews, talk to all those people, hear their stories. Some of these interviews went on for hours. What was that like for you as a reporter, as a journalist?
There was a wide range. There were interviews that were reminiscent, and people were joyful and having memories and remembering the times they spent with George Floyd, or they got very theatrical and started mimicking him and talking how he spoke, and that sort of allowed us to experience who he was and his spirit a bit. And there were harder interviews where people were in tears, where people were struggling with the fact that they were still in grief. Like Robert said, a lot of his family members, his friends had to grieve publicly when he died, because as soon as he died, it became this big movement, and they didn't have that private moment. And because a lot of the work we were doing happened after the cameras had left and after the media spectacle had moved on, people were sort of silently dealing with the fact that their friend, the person they knew, their loved one, was gone. And so a lot of those interviews were hard. But I think one of the things we wanted to do in the book was to not only showcase the pain and the suffering, but also the perseverance, as Robert said, the joy that can be found in the Black community, even when times are hard, even when racism and inequality is so evident, that people still persevere. And we wanted to showcase that, and we were able to talk to people who knew George Floyd as a child, talk to his family members who knew him from his earliest moments, and really see the arc of his life. And I think that allowed us to tell a full story about who he was. And I think even the people who experienced pain as they were remembering some of these memories, they appreciated the fact that we were able to not just cast him as this hashtag, as only the movement, as only the tragedy of his death, but also talk about his full life, talk about his dreams, talk about the things he wanted to do with his life, the highs that he had in his experience, the fact that as a child he wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, and we spoke to his second grade teacher, and she remembered him from 40 odd years ago, and the fact that he was reading and writing on grade level and as a second grader, despite growing up in deep poverty, and how much that stood out to his teacher at the time, and the fact that he wrote an essay or a couple of sentences as a second grader for an assignment where he said, I want to be a Supreme Court justice because I want to administer the law in a fair and just way. And so people remembered him. He had that kind of impact on people, and so that allowed us as reporters to be able to draft a life story that was meaningful and was something that people who knew him would say was true to him.
Yeah, and one of the funny things that I think about when I think about George Floyd is, how, small things happen to you as children that you don't have any say in, but they dictate the course of your life. So one of the things about George Floyd was when he was a kid, his aunts thought he looked like Flip Wilson. Do you guys know who Flip Wilson was? And so they used to debate whether or not he would wear a wig and like taught him to say like the devil made me do it and all these things. And that sort of attitude, that like learning to love people, learning to make people laugh, that sort of carried on through the course of his life. And so one of the conversations that we had with one of his best friends, Daryl Hunter, he said, everyone likes you. What do you do? Like, what makes you you? And George Floyd tells him, when I see a person who I've seen before, I look for something that's different, like their new shoes or new hairstyle, and I compliment them on that thing. I want people to know that I'm seeing them for the person they want to be. And so like when you're hearing those sorts of stories about a man, right, that sort of takes away some of the initial sort of sadness about why you're meeting. And I think the other thing is that we had started this reporting in sort of an in-between time. When we started, we did not know Derek Chauvin, who had murdered George Floyd, would be convicted. We did not know whether or not the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act would be passed. And so there were some times where we were sitting down and talking, but a lot of times were in the silences, the times when they were running back to the courthouse, or they were sitting in a room staring at nothing, just wondering what would happen, the times when they'd go to the Mall of America. Those experiences, more so than the sit-down times, really are the formation of what's in the pages.
I found it really interesting, when I learned that in many of his conversations, he would always tell people he loved them. It's like that was his goodbye, which, that kind of emotion, maybe we don't really connect to Black men all the time. Can you just talk a little bit about that and the kind of, person he was and how much he showed love to those who were around him and in his life?
Yeah, we actually start the book with those words, I love you, because 400 interviews, I can't tell you, Robert probably can't tell you either, how many times we heard people say, George Floyd would always say, I love you. He was 6'6", 200 something pounds, big guy, he worked out, and it just stood out to people that this big guy who you might be intimidated by if you're going by the stereotype would go around, being a softie and saying, I love you to men, women, children, just basically anyone. And he wanted to kind of put love into the world. And he told his friends that he wanted to put love into the world because he felt that, in many cases he had a lot of loss, and a lot of people he grew up around died early deaths. And he said, I want to make sure the last thing that you remember me saying to you was, I love you. And so he'd end conversations like that. His aunt showed us text messages where he would type it out in all caps, and that would be the last thing that he said to them. And so it's very easy to have a single story and judge someone based on a stereotype or on the worst thing they ever did or on their criminal record. But in between all of those things, you have a human being. You have someone who, yes, is flawed and may acknowledge those flaws and know those flaws, but is human and, actually has love for people and is loved by people. And that represented what was lost when George Floyd was killed, not only the broader movement and the national and international protests that took place after he died, but also in the quiet, like Robert said, in the quiet places, the people who knew him best remembered that he would go around saying, I love you to them. And so we heard that so often, and there are a couple of lines in the book where we quote those scenes of George Floyd ending a conversation saying, I love you. And as reporters, we tend to have a skeptical view of things and want to make sure we confirm things, but because we heard this so often from so many people who didn't know each other, and they would repeat the same words, they'd repeat the same cadence, they'd repeat the same experiences that they had with George Floyd, we were pretty confident that this was accurate and this was how he operated. And in some of the videos that we saw that he posted to social media before he died, we could hear him saying, I love you, man. And even in the video of his death, some of his final words were to his mother saying, "Mama, I love you. Tell my kids I love them." And so it was important for us to showcase that part of his personality as well.
Yeah, the first time I heard a story about George Floyd saying "I love you" to someone came from one of his first girlfriends who I met. His name was Courtney Ross, and she tells this story about how they meet outside of a homeless shelter, and he kisses her in the glow of midnight, and then after go, "Yes, because I love you." And I thought, well, that's lovely. And then I met the second girlfriend, and she tells me a story about how they're on a hill and they were kissing during midnight, and she says, "I love you." And I said, well, guys got game. But like after that, we kept on hearing it from different sorts of people, and that it wasn't a matter of game. Like it was a life philosophy. And one of the really interesting things is, as journalists, we try very hard not to enter into people's heads. Like that's not a thing that we do. And George Floyd was not able to help us with this project, but he did leave a bunch of writing, poems that he had written to himself, diary entries. And in all of them, you just sort of had this sense of him trying to write something, not just with himself, but in the world. And he would say, one of the things that I think about a lot is, one time he says, life sucks, but life never sucks, which I think is a part of him sort of trying to understand that terrible things happen, but it's really a perspective and a point of view that matters. And that goes hand in hand with him saying, "I love you." That's the cruelness of this, right? The three words that we associate George Floyd with, that we would have, or "I can't breathe." But if he were living today, the three words would have been "I love you." And I think it's important that we sit with that.
No, I agree. What was it like, and I know that you talked to so many people, but those closest to him, his family, his brother, those that you all had countless conversations with, how we saw kind of how they dealt with all of this, but, what were they really going through? What was this really like for them? For those of us who haven't had the opportunity to speak with his family, what did they think of everything that he became? The hashtag, the videos that were out there, the marches we saw, just everything that we saw, the murals everywhere. How did they deal with all of that?
I mean, it's a big family, and they all dealt with it in ways that were different. But the broad general strokes is that it was incredibly surreal for them. I mean, Tolu, in the reporting, went through so much of his family history, 7 generations worth. But by the time we got to the Floyd family as we knew them today, they were an incredibly humble family. They're truck drivers and plant workers. They believed that the way to get by in America was not really to stand out, to do your part, provide for your kids, get a job, stay out of trouble. That's what the Floyd family was like. And then they're thrown in this whirl, and people who never knew their brother, who, if he were living, he'd be, that uncle that everyone loves, but they're like, well, that's just Uncle Barry. That he was blown up into something larger than life. And for Philonise and Rodney, particularly, and his nephew, Brandon Williams, who really took up the mantle for the family and being the public-facing members of the family, you could always sort of see this like real tension that they felt there was no other choice than to live the way they were living. That, you know, Al Sharpton says, be here, and they have to be here. You know, one day they're mourning their brother, next day they're getting a phone call from Tyler Perry or Robert Smith. And that is a very jarring thing for them. I mean, one of the moments that I remember, the first time we were supposed to sit down with the family was after they had a big protest in Washington. And Philonis gets up there. This is the first time they're really speaking publicly to a swell of people. And he's up there on the Lincoln Memorial, and he looks down, and he sees that plaque that says, "This is where Martin Luther King had the I Had a Dream speech." And he, you know, it just tears him up inside. He couldn't finish the speech. And he was completely overwhelmed that day. By the time things turn around and it's a year, he knows what to do. He has an idea of what to say. That's the sort of journey they've been on. But fundamentally, it was all to give meaning to the life of their brother. That also meant that they never fully got to mourn him in the way any family member would want to mourn their brother.
I spoke earlier about George Floyd's story being an American story, and one of the things we did was trace George Floyd's family history, basically back to the founding of America, back to the time of slavery. And his great-great-grandfather was born enslaved, and by the time he was 6 or 7 years old, the Civil War happened, and he was freed, and he spent 30 years working in North Carolina, working on tobacco farms and working to basically build a life for his family, working with his hands. And by the time he reaches middle age, he's got a large family, and he's worked hard enough that he owns 500 acres of land. And he's one of the wealthiest men in eastern North Carolina, just from hard work. Not, he was forbidden from learning how to read. He was born enslaved. He had all the chips stacked against him, but he worked hard. He had a big family. They all worked hard together, and he became one of the wealthiest men in his community. But he was a black man, and that was not welcomed in that community by people who didn't like the fact that there was a wealthy black man with a wealthy black family. And so essentially his great-great-grandfather was dealt with and had all of his land stripped away through fraud, through fake tax liens. We went through and looked at all the documentation. Amazingly, in the 21st century, you can pull up a lot of this stuff online through various records that have been digitized, and we saw where his land was legally taken away from him by the authorities. And so by the time George Floyd's great-grandparents come around, they are born into poverty. They had to start from scratch. And that poverty continued through the family line until George Floyd was born in North Carolina to a family of sharecroppers. And that was his American experience, not being able to benefit from generational wealth, not being able to inherit the hard work of his ancestors, having parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who worked hard all their lives and had all of their wealth transferred over to the landowners in the sharecropping system. And so that is also an American experience. That's an experience that goes back to the founding of this country. And it makes us question, when someone is dealt that hand and born into that kind of poverty, what kind of chance do they have? Now, George Floyd continued to strive. It's not like he gave up because his family had been discriminated against, but in a just world, he would have been born a wealthy heir of a hardworking and industrious family. And so it was important for us to showcase that is also an American story. And George Floyd knew of that history. He learned of it through oral history passed down from his parents and grandparents. And that is also part of the reason why his family was as humble as they were. They knew that if you speak out too much or if you live too extravagantly, you could have everything taken away from you. And so that was also part of their ethos as they were going through this experience, and realizing that they were cast into this role of, leaders of a movement that they originally would not have had anything to do with, because they were just working hard, providing for their children, and just trying to make it. But after George Floyd died, they found themselves as activists, and they had to learn that role as well.
I'm curious how you both have changed as journalists after this, completing this project, if you will. I mean, other than you have changed roles a bit, and you're starting a new job. That's an obvious one. But how has this process and this book changed you both as journalists?
I think for me, there's one of the things that I remember so clearly is during the trial, I had attended a protest. It wasn't a protest, it was a rally that was for a woman named Tashira Garraway, and Tashira's boyfriend, the son of her son's father, had been killed. He was found disfigured in a dumpster in 2009 after a police chase. The man's name was Justin Tigan. And Tashira had asked one of George Floyd's girlfriends to come and support her at a rally. It was the first time that Courtney Ross was speaking out because she was nervous that she might do something to cause a mistrial. And when we got there, we tell the story in the book, but there were all these other women, primarily women, who had lost their sons or their lovers to police violence, and they did it at a time when there were no cameras. No one believed them, and they're still fighting for things. They're still fighting for some semblance of justice. And as we were there, someone saw on a text message that police had killed another black man. And that man, who's only 18, hardly a man, his name was Daunte Wright. And all those people, they stopped what they were doing, they packed up, and they went to go support Daunte Wright's parents. They stopped what they were doing. And at this moment, I'm trying to make sense of it all, as everyone who was in the Floyd family's orbit was. And it became clear to me, like, for maybe embarrassingly the first time, that this thing called racism just doesn't linger over us, right? It moves like a force. It oozes like toothpaste. And that if you do not think about it and address it and confront it, it will eventually envelope you. It will consume you. It might kill you. That doesn't mean just for black people, right? Courtney Ross was a white woman. Daunte Wright's mother was a white woman. And so for me, it really was sort of a call to action in a way that I didn't really feel like before. I didn't feel was appropriate, in terms of when we speak about issues that are hard, to speak about them in the softest, most genteel ways possible so we don't offend a reader. Sometimes I learned that it was really important to name things for what they were, and to make sure that people felt a sense of urgency, like a sense of desperation, that if we do not do our part to think about systemic racism in this country, it's coming for us. So the question really is, what are you going to do?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I thought that I was, sufficiently active. I lived east of the river, and, I went to all the right events and, tried to read the right books at the time that George Floyd died. And I think through the process of writing this book and doing the research for this book, I realized that I had not been doing enough to educate myself, to be active, to see everybody, every person for the individual that they are, not for a stereotype. And, you know, we talked about Tyre Nichols, and we talked about the fact that we didn't talk about the fact, but the 5 police officers that killed him were all black. And so it's not as if, you know, having a certain skin color protects you from having institutional bias or being impacted by it or being influenced by it. And so I had to check myself and say, what are the stereotypes that I'm allowing to feed into my world? If I came across a George Floyd, you know, before he died, would I have a certain image in my mind before getting to know him as we got to know him through these interviews and research? Would I have ever gotten to know a George Floyd? And so I had to, you know, grapple with some of these tough questions. And I think, you know, the process of going through this research and doing this book allowed me to question myself and check myself and say that even if one feels like they're doing the right things or one is sufficiently educated, it's a constant process. As Robert said, it's a force that you kind of constantly have to be working against, and we can't be complacent. It's very easy to grow complacent for one reason or the other. And so this process allowed me to realize that I have to constantly be re-energizing myself for the fight and for the effort against systemic racism. I'm a journalist, I'm not a policymaker, I'm not an activist, but I think it's very fair game for journalists to say that one of our goals is to stamp out and reduce systemic racism in the country. And so whether that means writing specific kinds of stories that highlight these things, or asking questions of people in power to make sure that they are on the right side of history, things that several years ago or decades ago might have been seen as activism in the journalistic space. I think today we have to question whether or not we are doing enough in those spaces. And so that's one of the things that changed for me as we did this book.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you both. I'm going to get to the first question we have here. Given that the conditions of deep poverty, institutional racism, and segregation exist in DC, with many schools serving largely black and brown students, what message would you present to city leaders?
That's a good question. I covered the city for 4 years at the Washington Post, so it's a question that's very dear to me. I think one of the things that, when it comes to looking at DC, that we have to remember is that, you know, despite our liberal predilections, we still deal with incredible gaps between life expectancy, between economic opportunity, between blacks and whites. And all of that has to do with a history that too has not been completely acknowledged, right? Now, if you talk to some people about the plan, you know, what people thought would happen in the 1970s when whites began building highways and things like that, looking at the district, people would say, if you lived during those times, you're seeing sort of the fulfillment of said plan. And if you're working in a community like that, having that sort of knowledge and background is really important. I think it's also really true that in terms of being educated and up on this stuff, how the books that are being distributed, the books that are being read within public schools, within charter schools are really important. And to continue to remind folks that even though we're, 95, 96% Democratic city, even though we share sort of the same broad strokes of politics, that does not mean we are immune from any of these things. And to be able to have honest conversations about that's a very important thing.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And one of the things we found in the book was in the city of Houston, which was reluctant to embrace the decision of the Supreme Court after Brown versus the Board of Education, and spent years upon years delaying the process of integration, even after they were, ordered by the courts to integrate. There's only so much that leaders can do because they had to follow those court orders. They sent white teachers into black schools and black teachers into white schools, and they started doing busing and trying to integrate their school systems. And then they saw people start to change their actions based on the fact that all of a sudden there were black kids in the school. Now a lot of the white parents were leaving the school district, taking their kids into private school, trying to form new districts of their own in their communities and cordon themselves off. So there's a certain amount that can be done through policies, but it's very important for hearts and minds to be changed and people to buy into the idea of an integrated, equal society, because even in a place where it's 95% democratic, it's very easy for those old entrenched systems to rear their head and people to have their own self-interest and people to self-sort, and those kinds of things can easily happen. And so I think city leaders have a role to play, definitely, but citizens and residents also have a role to play in trying to uphold a more equal and a more just society. It's difficult because old habits die hard, and there's a long history here, but it's important for society for there to be that kind of equality, and it in my opinion is going to have to involve not only leadership but also sort of a bottom-up grassroots kind of movement as well.
Yeah. How can we push hard to dismantle qualified immunity? If not, that's a gross injustice. Oh, the guy with a t-shirt that says, "Fight evil, read books."
It's a good question.
Yes. Oh, okay, I couldn't see back there.
No.
Your question.
Thanks for coming. So we don't do policy prescriptions. It's a bit out of our pocket for what we do as journalists, but we can talk a little bit about qualified immunity and what we learned during the book in terms of what has been some of the holdups with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So the first thing is that, so for those who don't know, what qualified immunity does is it prevents a police officer from being liable if they produce an act of violence. So in the case in which Tolu did not like a paragraph I liked, and he was a police officer and he did something to me, I could not sue Tolu. A ban on qualified immunity would allow me to do so. So there are a few things that happened. One, there's a larger idea, which is really the course of everything we talk about, whether you look at the individual or whether you look at the system. Now, if you believe in qualified immunity, that means you're saying a single police officer should not be held accountable because they were trained improperly, right? So you have to do that. Now, here's the tricky part. The people who are largely Republicans who made that argument also made the argument that you cannot file a civil lawsuit if we get rid of qualified immunity. So you could not sue the police officer, and you could also not sue the police department civilly. That means no justice, essentially, right? So when you're looking at that, you have to kind of take away the arguments. The first argument, right, is about whether or not a police officer should individually be held liable, right? You can have some movement on that. People had some movement on that, but it was also coupled with whether police officer and police department should both be held liable if something went wrong. So the question is fundamentally the universal question, right? Which is, how do you end racism, right? And who do you hold accountable? So until we get to a point where we can say it's okay to do both, then there's not going to be a lot of movement on it. So I think that's sort of the larger thing and larger discussion that people are trying to debate. And there have been times when it felt like they were pretty close. And every time it felt like people were pretty close, there was another measure of the act that someone wanted to take away or swap. So sadly, it's a tale of politics as usual for something that no one wants to be usual.
Yeah. What were some of the findings from your research about structural racism that most surprised you?
We haven't talked much about George Floyd's experience with the criminal justice system before May 25th, 2020, but one of the things that we learned was just how pervasive policing was in the community that George Floyd grew up in, Houston's 3rd Ward, majority black, majority impoverished community, where there was crime, but police were viewed as an occupying force in many ways while George Floyd was growing up. And we went into a lot of the cases that were on his criminal record. And one of the things we found was that, from talking to people, from doing the research, from looking at some of the cases that were later thrown out, was that there was a lot of corruption in the policing force in Houston at the time. And one of the things that surprised me was how much one bad apple, how much damage one bad apple can do in a community. There was one officer who was later charged with murder who arrested George Floyd in 2005 and said he was selling $10 worth of drugs. And George Floyd ended up pleading guilty because he pled guilty every time he got a charge because he couldn't afford a lawyer. He told his friends he didn't do it. The evidence was shaky. The officer was later found to be crooked. But George Floyd spent 10 months in jail for that charge. And, 10 months may not seem like a long time, but when I talk about the amount of damage one person can do, you multiply that 10 months across multiple people who were charged, dozens of people who were charged by this same officer. And not only that, you multiply that 10 months by the amount of lost wages. The fact that when you're a convicted felon in Texas, you don't have an opportunity to get any of the state licenses that would allow you to work legally for a number of hundreds of different jobs. Things like becoming a barber or a real estate agent. You can't get a license because you have a felony on your record. And so that kind of compounding impact from, one bad apple, and people talk about that often when they talk about police, they talk about how, the vast majority of police officers are good, which they are, but they don't say the second part, that there are some bad apples, there are some bad police officers, and they don't talk about how much damage just one officer can do in a community, and how that multiplies when you have someone who's not in the community because they're locked up, not getting treatment while they're locked up because the jails are overcrowded and underfunded. And George Floyd went into a number of his prison stints saying he needed treatment, saying he had a substance use issues, saying that he was depressed and that he wanted treatment. And in Texas, where they underfunded the police, or they underfunded the prison system and they overcrowded it, he never got that treatment. And so that kind of compounding impact continues. It reverberates. It leads people to recidivate. It leads people to feel like they don't have any other choice but to enter into the underground economy. And we read about these things, we see the statistics, but just seeing it play out in one person's life as we did this research, seeing it play out in a community and seeing that kind of impact was surprising to me, because I have read about these things in the past, but it doesn't come to life in a way that you see the full scope of it until you see how one community can be impacted, even by just one or two bad police officers.
One thing that really has become resident now when we think about Tyre Nichols and sort of the similarities that you saw within the case with George Floyd, one has to do with the nature of the police report, right? The fact that immediately there was a covering up of what had actually transpired. If not a cover-up, then not a full discussion of the things that went wrong or the things that the police were supposed to do or did not do. I did not know there was a study that came out in 2021 that had noted that they had found at least 17,000 cases in which people had died at the hands of police that were misclassified, right? That there was a report that was issued, everyone said it was true, but then when people did digging, they turned out that it was a homicide or it was something far more serious. Also, when we think about the relationship between the police officer, who in this case might kill you, the medical examiner who determines the cause of death for the public, the paramedic who's supposed to save you, right? The relationship between those three branches, it's very close and terrible things can happen. One of the things that the research found was that 22% of medical examiners had said they had been coerced at some point in their time to change their cause of death because of pressure from a police department or a public official. 22%, that's a lot of people. And when we're thinking about all of that, right, and what it does in terms of the transfer of justice by the time a case gets to a jury, if it gets to a jury, the stakes are already really high for a justice for a person who died. Like we said, we know about George Floyd and Tyre Nichols, but there are untold numbers of people like George Floyd and Tyre Nichols who occupy a murky middle, and those numbers, those statistics sort of capture that. That's one thing that I found to be really stunning, but a really big stumbling block when we think about the ways that a person might be able to gain some semblance of justice from the American justice system. A second thing is that we're just really on the precipice of seeing the research that talks about the impact, the deep impact of what things like this, waking up every day, fearing those lights out there might lead to the end of you, can have on the spirit of Black bodies. You saw that it was very pronounced in the life of George Floyd, who always felt he needed to shrink himself. He couldn't be proud of the body he had created for himself through his own hard work. And I think, having those sorts of discussions about what a person's relationship is to the space of walking through the life of America were really some of the more fascinating parts of what we had learned.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. It's been a great discussion. I don't know if we can give them a round of applause for their hard work and for sharing. Yes.